In this video, we follow the powerful story of Dr. Karen O'Donnell, a physician who, after denying care to a patient wearing a MAGA hat, learns a shocking truth: he's the hospital CEO. What follows is a journey of self-reflection, growth, and redemption as Karen works to confront her biases and rebuild trust, not just with the patient, but with her entire hospital community. Watch as Karen transforms her approach to care, learning that empathy and inclusivity are the true cornerstones of healthcare. The waiting room of St. Gregory's Hospital was filled with the usual mix of patients, the elderly, young children, parents, and professionals, all anxiously waiting for their turn. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a sterile glow on the bright white walls. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, and the sound of the receptionist's keyboard clicking away added a faint rhythm to the background. The receptionist, a young woman named Lily, shuffled papers as she greeted patients and directed them to the appropriate waiting areas. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, or so it seemed. Dr. Karen O'Donnell had just finished her morning rounds and was now heading toward the break room for a cup of coffee. She'd been with St. Gregory's for over 10 years, an emergency room doctor who had seen it all. She was sharp, focused, and deeply committed to her work. Over the years, she had earned the respect of her colleagues and was known for her quick decision-making skills in the but she also had strong opinions, particularly about politics. A progressive through and through, Karen often found herself at odds with many of the political symbols that seemed to be becoming more common in public spaces. As she entered the break room, her mind was still occupied with a particularly challenging case she'd handled earlier that morning. But just as she reached for her coffee mug, the door to the break room swung open, and a young man walked in. He was dressed casually, wearing a red MAGA hat perched firmly on his head. Karen paused for a moment. She wasn't sure what bothered her more, the hat itself or the fact that it felt like it was everywhere these days, showing up in spaces that were supposed to be apolitical. She had her own strong feelings about the MAGA movement, and to her, the red hat represented everything she disliked about the political climate. But this was a hospital, a place of healing and care, and she quickly pushed her feelings aside, focusing on the task at hand. The man walked past her, and she noticed that he was heading toward the reception area. She didn't think much of it at first, but then she overheard the receptionist, Lily, speaking with him in hushed tones. "I'm sorry, sir," Lily said, her voice shaky, "but we have a policy here about not allowing political symbols in the building." She turned toward the reception desk, her gaze now fixed on the scene unfolding before her. The patient, the man in the MAGA hat, was standing there, looking bewildered. He wasn't raising his voice, but there was something about his demeanor that struck Karen. He wasn't angry, but he was clearly caught off guard by the response he was receiving. Lily hesitated for a moment, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed something into the computer. "I'm afraid I can't let you see a doctor if you're wearing that hat, sir. It's against hospital policy to allow political attire. You'll have to remove it before I can proceed with your intake." The man looked down at his hat, then back at Lily. He appeared calm, but Karen noticed a flicker of frustration in his eyes. She watched for a moment, unsure of how to intervene. But then the moment was over. Karen had made her decision. She felt a strange sense of obligation to speak up. She pushed open the break room door and approached the reception desk. The moment she walked into view, the man turned toward her. His face was polite, but still clearly confused. Lily was standing behind the desk, her expression apologetic but firm. "Is there a problem?" Karen asked, walking up to the desk with a measured calm. She had to know more before stepping into this situation. Her instinct was to solve the issue, but there was something about the exchange that didn't sit right with her. "This gentleman is trying to check in, but he insists on wearing his MAGA hat," Lily said nervously. "And we have a policy about no political symbols." Karen felt her stomach tighten. "I understand, Lily. Thank you for your diligence." She turned to the man, who was standing there, still clutching the brim of his hat in his hands. He was looking at her with a faint, almost puzzled expression. "Waiting for some resolution, sir," Karen began, her tone firm but measured. "Unfortunately, we cannot allow political symbols in the building. It's a hospital policy." She tried to make her words sound as neutral as possible. But inside, there was a sense of righteous certainty. In her mind, it wasn't just a hospital policy. It was a principle one that aligned with the values she believed in. No one, she thought, should walk into a space meant for healing and bring the toxicity of political divisions with them. The man looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm just here for a checkup," he said quietly, almost apologetically. "I don't want any trouble. I just need to see a doctor." Karen stood her ground, her gaze unyielding. She didn't want to make a scene, but she was already preparing herself for the inevitable conversation she'd have with her colleagues. If the man couldn't remove the hat, then he couldn't be seen. It was as simple as that. "I'm afraid that's the rule here," Karen reiterated. "If you refuse to comply, I'll have no choice but to ask you to leave." Karen froze, her hand still gripping the coffee mug. The man sighed, the expression on his face softening as he took the hat off, revealing his closely cropped hair. "Fine," he said, almost reluctantly, but then added, "I'll comply. But I still don't understand what the problem is." Karen didn't answer him right away. She felt a wave of guilt rising within her. She knew it wasn't about the hat, it was about everything else. The MAGA hat was just a symbol, a reminder of the divisive political landscape that had become so entrenched in everyday life. And here, in the hospital, she had found herself unwilling to set those divisions aside. The man quietly handed the hat to Lily, who placed it on the counter. Karen quickly turned away, her mind racing as she returned to the staff room, unsure whether she had done the right thing. As the day went on, Karen felt increasingly uneasy. She knew she had followed the policy, but the discomfort was nagging at her. She thought back to the man's face, the confusion in his eyes, and the quiet frustration that he hadn't voiced. Maybe she had acted too hastily. She had judged him by a symbol he wore and failed to see him as more than just a supporter of a political movement. At the end of her shift, Karen decided to stop by the front desk to check on things. As she walked up, she noticed the man from earlier, now sitting in one of the exam rooms, his clothes folded neatly next to him. He didn't look like someone who belonged to the political extremes that she had expected. Something clicked in Karen's mind, and she suddenly wondered if she had made a mistake. But before she could think any further, her shift was over. Unbeknownst to her, the man who had quietly complied with her decision was more than just a patient. He was someone who would soon be more than a passing moment in her day. He was about to reveal himself as something far more significant than Karen had imagined. A revelation that would change everything. The following morning, the typical hum of the hospital echoed through the sterile corridors. Nurses hurried to and fro, patients sat quietly in waiting rooms, and the sound of medical equipment whirring and beeping filled the air. But for Dr. Karen O'Donnell, the sense of normalcy was far from real. Her actions from the previous day weighed heavily on her, and as much as she tried to push the incident from her mind, it kept creeping back, clouding her thoughts and making her uneasy. She had always been someone who prided herself on being professional and neutral, especially in her role as an emergency room doctor. It was essential to give every patient the care they needed without judgment or bias. But yesterday, she had let her personal political views overshadow her duties. She had denied a patient care based solely on a symbol, his MAGA hat. The fact that she could justify her decision in the moment still stung. But it was the thought of that man's face, the confusion, the discomfort that haunted her. Karen's train of thought was broken by the sound of her pager buzzing in her pocket. She quickly checked it and sighed. It was a request to meet with the CEO of the hospital. She had heard his name often but had never met James Carter in person. St. Gregory's hospital was a large facility, and the CEO was a figure she rarely interacted with. His role was more behind the scenes, overseeing operations, financials, and administration. Without much thought, Karen walked toward the administration office. Her mind was still preoccupied, but she couldn't help feeling a sense of impending anxiety. She had no idea what the meeting was about, but the timing seemed unusual. Why today, after everything that had happened yesterday? As Karen approached the office, she was greeted by a friendly receptionist who directed her to a conference room at the end of the hall. The room was modern and well-lit, with a large window that looked out over the city skyline. It was an office meant to impress, with sleek furniture and tasteful decor. But Karen was too distracted by her own thoughts to appreciate the aesthetics. She stepped inside, and her eyes immediately locked onto the man sitting at the large conference table. It was the same man, the patient from yesterday, the one she had turned away, the one wearing the MAGA hat. But this time, there was no red cap. Instead, he was dressed in a sharp business suit, looking every bit the professional. His demeanor was calm and collected, and as she entered, he looked up, his eyes briefly meeting hers. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, but his expression remained neutral, almost inscrutable. Karen's heart skipped a beat. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This was no ordinary patient. This was James Carter, the CEO of St. Gregory's Hospital, the same man she had refused to treat the day before, based solely on his political attire. For a moment, Karen froze, caught off guard. She had no idea what to say. She could feel her face flush with embarrassment, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. The weight of her mistake was crushing, and she felt exposed. James Carter broke the silence first, his voice calm but firm. "Dr. O'Donnell, I asked you to meet with me because I need to discuss what happened yesterday." Karen nodded quickly, trying to gather her composure. "Mr. Carter, I didn't realize it was you," she began, her voice shaky. "If I had known, I would have." He held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. "Karen, this isn't about me being upset. It's about the larger issue at hand." He paused for a moment, as if weighing his words. "I'm not here to make this personal. I'm here to talk about what happened and why it's a problem." Karen felt a knot form in her stomach. She had hoped for a more forgiving response, but she knew deep down that there was no easy way to undo her actions. "I understand, Mr. Carter. I was wrong," she admitted, her voice quiet but sincere. "I shouldn't have made assumptions based on your hat. It was unprofessional of me." James leaned back in his chair, his expression still calm, though there was a hint of disappointment in his eyes. "You were wrong, Karen. But what's more important is why you made that decision. What does it say about the way we view our patients? About how easily we can let our personal biases affect our actions?" Karen swallowed hard. She hadn't anticipated the conversation taking this turn. I let my personal beliefs cloud my judgment," she confessed, her voice cracking. "I thought I was doing the right thing, standing by my values. But now, I see that it was a mistake." James nodded, as if he expected her response. "We can all be guilty of that," he said, his tone softening slightly. "We live in a divided world, and it's easy to draw lines based on our beliefs. But as a healthcare professional, you can't afford to do that. Every patient who walks through these doors deserves the same care, regardless of their political views, religious beliefs, or anything else." Karen nodded, the weight of his words settling on her. I know that now." They sat in silence for a moment, the atmosphere between them heavy with the weight of the conversation. Karen wasn't sure what else to say. She had already apologized, and she could see that James wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for accountability and growth. Finally, James broke the silence. "Karen, I want you to understand something," he said, his voice steady. "What happened yesterday isn't just a matter of one doctor making a mistake. It's a systemic issue. It's about the culture we create here at St. Gregory's as a hospital. We are meant to provide care without discrimination. But if we allow ourselves to make judgments based on political symbols or any other factors, we fail our patients and we fail ourselves." Karen felt her chest tighten. The magnitude of the issue was sinking in. "I never meant to fail anyone. I didn't think it would matter. I thought the symbol would tell me everything I needed to know." "That's the problem," James replied, leaning forward. "We can't make assumptions about people based on their appearances or the symbols they wear. We need to see them for who they really are. And you failed to do that yesterday." Karen's head hung low, the guilt gnawing at her. She had made a snap decision, and now she had to live with the consequences. She had denied a patient, not because of his health needs, but because of a symbol he wore. It wasn't just an error, it was a failure of empathy and professional ethics. James studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate your honesty, Karen, and I believe you will learn from this. But I'm going to need you to demonstrate that, not just to me, but to the rest of the hospital staff. We need to foster an environment of inclusivity, where everyone feels welcome, no matter what they believe." Corinne's heart sank further. I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. As the meeting came to a close, Corinne walked out of the conference room, her mind spinning. What had started as a simple moment of professional discomfort had turned into a wake-up call. She had let her judgment be clouded by the hat, the symbol of division. And now she was facing the reality of how deeply those biases had affected her care. She had not only failed that patient, but she had failed herself as a doctor and as a human being. It was clear now that her journey wasn't just about becoming a better doctor, it was about becoming a better person. And the path ahead would require deep introspection, difficult conversations, and a commitment to change that would take time. But it was a path she was ready to walk. The day after her meeting with James Carter, Corinne O'Donnell sat in the break room, her mind swirling with thoughts. She had made a commitment to change, but the gravity of what had happened still lingered heavily on her heart. There was no easy way to undo the damage done, but Corinne was determined to prove that she could be better, to show that her lapse in judgment didn't define who she was. The hospital had always been her sanctuary, a place where she felt she could do the most good. But now it felt like a battleground, not just for patients, but for her own beliefs. As she stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, Corinne found herself reflecting on the uncomfortable truths James had pointed out. The line between professional responsibility and personal bias had blurred in her mind, and she had to work hard to separate them. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Lily, the receptionist from the previous day, peeked her head in. "Dr. O'Donnell?" Lily asked hesitantly. "There's someone here to see you. They're asking for you specifically." "Who is it?" Corinne asked, a little surprised. Lily didn't respond immediately, but her gaze shifted toward the doorway. As Corinne turned, she saw a man walk into the break room. The same man she had turned away yesterday. The man who was now standing in front of her, calm as ever. "Mr. Carter," Corinne said, suddenly aware of the deep discomfort in her chest. She stood quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her stethoscope. "I didn't expect you to come back today." "I didn't either," James said with a quiet chuckle. His voice had softened since their earlier conversation, and his smile was genuine. But there was still an air of seriousness in his demeanor. He wasn't here for small talk. "But I wanted to clear something up, something important." Corinne felt the floor beneath her feet shift slightly, a sudden unease creeping into her gut. She couldn't help but wonder if she had somehow failed again, made yet another mistake. But this time, there was an odd sense of curiosity that bubbled beneath the surface. She wanted to understand what was driving James to return. "I'm listening," Corinne said, her voice measured as she sat down. She gestured for him to take a seat across from her. She had learned it in the past. Few hours that her previous assumptions had been entirely wrong. Now she needed to listen, truly listen. James sat down with ease, his hands folded in front of him. "I'm not here to punish you, Corinne. I'm here to explain something that might surprise you." The tension in the air thickened, and Corinne braced herself for the unexpected. "I'm not just the CEO of this hospital, Corinne," James continued, his tone firm yet patient. "I'm also a civil rights lawyer. I've spent my entire career advocating for equal rights and fighting against systemic injustice. I've spent decades in courtrooms advocating for the disenfranchised, the marginalized, and the voiceless." Corinne blinked, stunned into silence. She had no idea. For all her years in medicine, her professional interactions with James had been limited to formalities. She had seen him only as the man who ran the hospital. But now, he was revealing a part of himself she couldn't have possibly anticipated. James continued, "I'm also part of a national coalition that works on policies around racial justice, LGBTQ+ rights, and women's health. But more than that, Corinne, I'm here because of something that you should know. Yesterday, when I walked into this hospital with my MAGA hat on, it wasn't to provoke. It was to test something." A lump formed in Corinne's throat, and her heart began to race. This was not what she had expected. She had already assumed, without question, that the hat meant something dangerous, something that immediately made him a political enemy in her eyes. She was wrong. "Test?" Corinne asked, her voice barely a whisper. James nodded. "Yes, I needed to see if our hospital's values, our supposed commitment to fairness, to inclusivity, would stand up to the test of political division. I've fought my whole career for equal treatment. But I also understand that there are people, even in healthcare, who see things differently. Karen's mind spun as she processed his words. She had been the one who had allowed political polarization to define her actions, to cloud her ability to treat this patient like any other. And now, here she was, hearing from the very man who ran the hospital, a man who had devoted his life to civil rights, that her decision had been a form of failure. James leaned forward, his expression more serious now. I knew what I was doing when I wore that hat here. Karen, I knew it would create a reaction. But the question is, would our hospital's policies hold up when faced with a person who didn't fit the ideal profile? Karen swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in her chest. I never imagined you were someone who would be impacted by a political symbol. I assumed things based on your appearance. That's the problem, James said, his voice quieter but more intense. And that's why I came here. We can't allow ourselves to make judgments about people, especially patients, based on symbols. We should have the compassion and understanding to treat everyone equally. You've seen my record, Karen, you know that. Karen nodded slowly, the weight of her actions fully dawning on her. Her immediate reaction to James, to the MAGA hat, was a result of her own biases, her own personal politics. She had failed him as a doctor, not because of his political beliefs, but because she had refused to see beyond the surface. She had let her discomfort guide her judgment, and in doing so, she had undermined her own professional integrity. I'm so sorry, Karen whispered, her voice trembling. She could feel her cheeks burn with the sting of shame. I shouldn't have treated you that way. I should have known better. You came in here for care, not politics. And I let my own feelings get in the way of that. James smiled gently, his tone softening. Karen, I didn't come here to point fingers or condemn you. I've been in your shoes before. We all have our biases. But what matters is what we do once we recognize them. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms thoughtfully. I came back to this hospital to help start a conversation. I didn't want to make you feel bad. I wanted to make sure that everyone, from the staff to the patients, realizes that we can't afford to let division rule our actions. Karen sat quietly for a moment, the gravity of the situation sinking in. The guilt she had been carrying around since yesterday was slowly turning into something else, something deeper. It wasn't just guilt. It was the realization that she had failed in a fundamental way. And now, she had the chance to make it right. I'll do better, Karen said, her voice steady. Despite the emotions welling up inside of her, I'll make sure something like this never happens again. And I'll work to make sure our hospital policies reflect the inclusivity we strive for. I can't undo what I did, but I can learn from it. James nodded, his face softening with a look of understanding. I believe you, Karen, but this isn't just about you. It's about all of us. We all need to come together to examine our biases, to examine how we operate here and in the world beyond. Karen stood up, feeling a sense of clarity that had eluded her the day before. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But she had the tools to start making things right. She had learned a painful, but invaluable lesson. It wasn't just about treating a patient. It was about understanding them, seeing them fully, without letting preconceived notions cloud her judgment. As Karen walked out of the conference room, her heart was heavy. But it was also filled with a new sense of purpose. She would do everything in her power to ensure that no other patient ever walked into this hospital and felt the sting of rejection because of the way they dressed, or the symbols they wore, or the beliefs they held. The following weeks after her conversation with James Carter were filled with a mixture of discomfort and resolve for Karen O'Donnell. The hospital environment had subtly changed for her, and she was keenly aware of how much her actions had shaken her professional confidence. Despite the busy days, the regular stream of patients, and the routine of emergency care, Karen couldn't shake off the weight of what had happened. Every decision she made seemed to reflect back on her previous mistake. And it wasn't until one of her colleagues pulled her aside that she began to see a path forward. It was a chilly morning, and Karen had just finished a long night shift. As she was walking toward the staff lounge to grab a quick coffee, she was greeted by Dr. Emily Warner, a fellow physician who had been Karen's friend and colleague for years. Emily had been noticeably quiet lately, which Karen assumed was due to her own busy schedule. But this morning, Emily had something on her mind. Karen, can we talk for a minute? Emily's voice was warm but serious. Karen nodded, leading them both into a quieter corner of the lounge. Of course, what's on your mind? Emily glanced around, making sure they were out of earshot from the other staff. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. I just wanted to check in with you. I know the last few weeks haven't been easy. You've been walking around with a lot on your shoulders, and I wanted you to know that you're not alone in this. Karen blinked, feeling the lump in her throat rise. She hadn't realized that others had noticed her inner turmoil. I didn't expect you to say that, Karen confessed softly. I know I messed up. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully make up for what I did, but I'm trying. Emily took a step closer, her tone more sincere than ever. We all make mistakes, Karen. That's part of being human. But the important thing is what you do afterward. It's how you grow and how you make things right. I've been watching you these past few weeks. You've been trying, and that's all that matters. Karen's heart softened at Emily's words. She had been trying, but it was hard to shake off the shame. Every time a new patient came into her care, she was reminded of the patient she had turned away, James Carter. Despite the apology and the lessons she had learned, it wasn't enough to let go of the self-doubt that lingered. I don't feel like it's enough, Karen admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm trying to be better, to check my biases, to listen more. But it's still hard to feel like I'm living up to my own standards. Emily smiled gently. Karen, it's not about being perfect. It's about progress. You've already made strides. You've started talking to people about inclusivity, about understanding each other despite our differences. You've taken responsibility. That's more than most people would do. You're on the right path. And the best part is that you're showing the rest of us how we can do better, too. Her words resonated deeply with Karen for the first time in weeks. Karen allowed herself to feel a sense of pride not in being flawless, but in being willing to change, to face her mistakes, and to seek redemption. Karen understood now that it wasn't just about her professional growth. It was about the collective effort to ensure that everyone, patient or staff, felt welcomed, respected, and valued. The next few days passed in a blur. Karen continued to work her shifts in the emergency department, treating patients with a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't expect immediate forgiveness or instant change. But as the days went on, something started to shift within her. She took small steps to ensure her interactions were filled with greater empathy. And when opportunities arose, she apologized to those who had witnessed her lapse in judgment. She had already apologized to James. But now she understood that it wasn't just about one person, it was about the environment she helped create in the hospital. One afternoon, as Karen was reviewing patient files, she was approached by Lily, the receptionist who had witnessed the interaction between Karen and James on the day of the incident. Lily was holding a file in her hands and looked somewhat hesitant. Dr. O'Donnell, can I talk to you for a moment? She asked. Karen looked up and smiled, inviting her to sit. Of course, Lily. What's going on? Lily seemed a bit uncomfortable, but quickly collected herself. I just wanted to thank you, she began, looking directly at Karen. After everything that happened with Mr. Carter and what you said afterward, I've noticed a change in you. You've been so much more open to talking to us, to listening. It's made a big difference around here, and I really appreciate it. Karen blinked, stunned. You noticed? Lily nodded. I've noticed how you've been engaging with the rest of the staff, making sure we feel heard. You've always been a great doctor, Karen. But the way you've handled this whole situation has been inspiring. We don't always see doctors being so introspective or willing to grow. It means a lot. The words hit Karen hard. She hadn't realized just how deeply her actions affected those around her. What seemed like small gestures, apologizing to staff, opening up about her own mistakes, were having a larger impact on the hospital culture. She had been so focused on her own internal struggle that she hadn't seen how her vulnerability was creating an environment where growth could flourish. I didn't realize how much this would change things, Karen admitted, her voice quiet. But I've learned that it's not just about me. It's about the example I set. It's about making sure everyone feels seen and valued. Lily smiled warmly. And you're doing that. You've set a tone that makes all of us think about how we approach each other. So, Thank you. Corinne's chest swelled with gratitude. She had taken one small step in the right direction, and it was already beginning to ripple out into the lives of others. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the right path. Her journey was not over, and there was still much work to be done. But the change she had hoped for was beginning to take shape. Later that week, Corinne found herself in the hospital's staff lounge, sitting with several colleagues. She had started talking more openly about her experience and how she was working on becoming more aware of her own biases. Dr. Emily Warner joined the conversation, and the topic turned to a recent initiative the hospital had been discussing, providing better care to underserved communities and implementing more inclusive practices. I think this is the perfect opportunity for us to build on the changes we've been making, Corinne said, her voice full of newfound confidence. I've been working on my own biases, and I want to take this further. I think we need to have a more open dialogue about inclusivity here. It's not just about treating patients, but making them feel welcomed no matter what they look like, where they come from, or what they believe. The conversation that followed was one of the most productive Corinne had experienced in a long time. Her colleagues were eager to discuss ways they could improve care for all patients, regardless of political or social background. There was a sense of camaraderie in the room as they shared ideas and made plans to organize community outreach events and training sessions on inclusivity. That evening, after her shift, Corinne took a walk through the hospital's quiet halls. The lights were dim, and the building felt more peaceful than it had in days. As she passed the emergency room, she stopped for a moment, staring at the familiar door. She was proud of the progress she had made, not just in treating patients, but in recognizing her own flaws and working to become a better version of herself. The hospital had always been her home, and now it felt like she was finally living up to the values it represented. As she turned to leave, she felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. She had learned so much about herself, about the importance of empathy, and about the value of listening. She had made mistakes, yes, but she had also grown, and in the process, she had inspired others to do the same. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Corinne knew one thing for certain. She was on the right path now. It had been a few months since Corinne O'Donnell had that pivotal conversation with James Carter, the CEO of St. Gregory's Hospital. As she sat at her desk, reviewing patient charts, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for a long time. The journey she had undergone, one that involved self-reflection, accountability, and growth, had transformed her both personally and professionally. The weight of the mistakes she made had been heavy, but it had also driven her to become a better doctor, a better colleague, and, ultimately, a better human being. Corinne had spent countless hours reflecting on the lessons she had learned. She had worked on being more self-aware of her biases and assumptions, engaging in discussions with colleagues, and actively participating in initiatives that promoted inclusivity. She had felt the ripple effect of her own efforts. As the hospital's culture began to shift, the more she focused on empathy, the more the team around her began to embrace it. The ripple had expanded beyond herself, and now the entire hospital was involved in this collective effort to make healthcare more equitable and inclusive. But that was only the beginning. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Corinne received an email from James Carter. As the hospital CEO, James was often busy with meetings and administrative tasks, but he had always made time to check in with his staff, especially those who had shown a commitment to the hospital's values. She opened the email, which read, Subject, a special opportunity. Dr. O'Donnell, I hope this message finds you well. I've been following your progress over the last few months, and I am impressed with the growth you've shown both personally and professionally. The hospital has seen a noticeable shift in culture since our conversation, and much of that is due to your efforts. That being said, I would like to offer you an opportunity to take your commitment to inclusivity even further. We are in the process of developing a new leadership position focused on diversity and inclusion, and I would be honored if you would consider taking on this role. The position would involve working closely with our staff and patients, helping us to refine our practices, develop training programs, and ensure that inclusivity is deeply embedded into everything we do. Please let me know if you would be interested in discussing this further. Sincerely, James Carter, CEO, St. Gregory's Hospital. Karen stared at the screen, her heart racing. She couldn't believe it. Just a few months ago, she had been in a position where she was unsure whether her career could ever recover from the mistakes she had made. But now, James was offering her the chance to lead this important initiative, to help shape the future of the hospital. The weight of the responsibility felt immense, but so did the opportunity. It was a chance to make real, lasting change on a much larger scale than she had ever imagined. Later that afternoon, Karen met with James in his office. The walls of his office were adorned with framed photos of the hospital's milestones, and the view from his window overlooked the city skyline. James was seated behind his desk, flipping through some papers. He looked up as Karen entered, smiling warmly. "Karen, I'm glad you could make it. Please, take a seat," James said, gesturing toward a chair across from him. Karen sat down, her mind racing with the possibilities of what this new role could mean. "I have to say, James, I'm honored by your offer, but I'm also a little overwhelmed. I never expected anything like this." James chuckled softly. "I understand. This is a big decision, but I've seen the work you've done here, and I believe you're the right person for the job. You've demonstrated a commitment to growth and a genuine desire to make this hospital a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of their background or beliefs." Karen nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had worked hard to get to this point, but now it felt like the true challenge was just beginning. She didn't want to let anyone down, especially the patients who had already trusted her. "I'm ready," Karen said, her voice filled with determination. "I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to put in the work. I want to help shape a culture here that not only acknowledges diversity, but actively embraces it." James smiled, a look of pride crossing his face. "I knew you would say that. This position is about more than just addressing diversity in terms of race or gender. It's about recognizing that every person who walks through our doors, whether as a patient or a staff member, comes with their own unique experiences and needs. This hospital is a place where we should meet those needs with compassion and respect, no matter where they come from." Karen's heart swelled with pride as she realized the full scope of what she was being asked to do. It wasn't just about one individual's experience. It was about creating an environment where every patient, regardless of their background or beliefs, felt respected and heard. "We'll need to start by revisiting some of the policies in place," James continued. "We need to make sure that they reflect the values of inclusivity and equality. You'll also be working with the department heads to implement training and workshops for our staff. This is a long-term initiative, and I want you to have the autonomy to shape it in a way that truly makes a difference." Karen nodded, feeling more confident now that she understood the role better. "I'll do my best to lead with empathy, to create a space where everyone can feel like they belong." James stood and extended his hand. "I have no doubt you will." As Karen left his office, she felt a surge of energy. This was more than just a new role, it was an opportunity to create lasting change. The path ahead would be filled with challenges, but Karen was ready. She was no longer the doctor who had made a hasty decision based on assumptions. She was a leader now, someone who would work tirelessly to create a hospital environment that embraced diversity, compassion, and respect. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Karen met with department heads, hospital administrators, and even patients, all to gather input on how the hospital could improve in terms of inclusivity. She collaborated with her colleagues to develop a series of training modules for staff, focusing on unconscious bias, patient-centered care, and the importance of creating a welcoming environment for everyone. There were setbacks, of course. Some staff members resisted change, unsure of how to navigate the new protocols or hesitant to confront their own biases. But Karen was steadfast. She reminded herself daily of why this was important, not just for the patients, but for the hospital community as a whole. This wasn't just about correcting a past mistake. It was about building something stronger, something better. Over time, the hospital culture began to shift. The training modules were embraced, and staff began to engage in more open, honest discussions about their own biases. There was a growing sense of unity among them, hospital staff as they worked together to make the environment more inclusive. Patients, too, began to notice the change. They felt heard, respected, and valued in a way they hadn't before. Corinne's commitment to empathy and inclusivity became the backbone of her leadership style. She didn't just talk about change. She lived it. She led by example, always taking the time to listen to her colleagues and patients. She was constantly learning, constantly growing. And then, one afternoon, as Corinne walked through the hospital hallways, she spotted James Carter again. He was speaking with a group of doctors, and as he noticed Corinne walking by, he excused himself and approached her with a smile. "How are things going?" James asked, his eyes warm with genuine interest. "It's going well," Corinne replied, her smile broadening. "There's a lot to do, but I'm seeing the changes I was hoping for. People are listening, and I think we're on the right track." James nodded, a proud expression on his face. "I knew you'd be the one to make it happen. You've changed not just the hospital, but the way we all think about care and what it truly means to treat everyone with respect." Corinne's heart swelled with pride. This was why she had worked so hard to create a space where everyone felt seen, heard, and respected. And she had done it. But she knew the journey wasn't over. This was just the beginning. As Corinne watched James walk back to the group of doctors, she realized how far she had come. She was no longer just a doctor who made a mistake. She was a leader who had learned, grown, and made a lasting impact. She had become the change she had always hoped to see. The hospital was different now. The culture was different. And Corinne knew, with a deep sense of conviction, that this was the work she was meant to do.